back in full force with not one, but 3 decks today. 3 monocolored creature decks with 3 very specific problems that make it the perfect chance to talk about bottlenecks. Arni has a complex text box that essentially amounts to bad attack cascade. We get the trigger whenever our creatures attack or enter attacking, so this is definitely a creature deck. And when it resolves, we get a creature with lesser mana value into play by paying 2 mana for it, which is an exchange we're only really profiting from when the creature in hand is at least 3 mana. So our creatures on board have to be at least 4 mana. Just like with Joda, we know that Cascade gets the most value when you find a mana value that's only 1 less than the spell that triggers it. So we get the most value when we narrow our focus to creatures with mana costs that are very close together. When those mana costs are minimized to the smallest 2 numbers that we're happy with, we have more of those triggers over the life of the game because we can start playing them at earlier stages of the game. That doesn't mean we can't or shouldn't play creatures with higher mana costs, but it does mean we're going to look more kindly towards cards that do fall in that 3 to 4 range. But there's another problem. We can only cheat in cards from our hand, and red isn't very good at actually drawing cards. This is our first bottleneck, something keeping the deck from powering up and playing with stronger decks, and what I would most be looking for in any upgrades. Knowing what the bottlenecks are not can also help you know where your cuts will come from as you refine the deck further. For this kind of video, I'd actually prefer to highlight some of what I think are the cards most essential to the core of the deck, which you can find in the description, but it's also important to identify which are not bottlenecks in a deck. Things that are important enough to include, but as you power up and the cuts get more difficult, these cards aren't pulling enough weight to play at higher power levels. For Arni, I think these cards provide important redundancy for the deck and actually allow us to cheat in more expensive creatures, but aren't nearly efficient enough to be able to carry the deck through games against higher power decks. Next, these 3 cards are among the best you can find to compensate for Arni's bottlenecks. Connecting the dots fills our hand based on our attacks, while Surge to Victory propels us across the finish line. Liquid Metal Torque in particular is so fundamentally game-changing for red that I do not play mono red without it. Red is so good at removing artifacts, and so bad at removing anything else, that most mono red decks bottleneck on having the removal you need to compete against the strongest decks. But Torque is on-rate ramp that can also upgrade all our artifact removal into anything removal, and has an easy home here. Next, we're looking at Eligeth and Siani, and in a mono blue deck, the bottleneck here is a little more nuanced. I've remarked before about the difference between decks that exist to support the commander and commanders that exist to support the deck, with the latter being best summarized by removal or resource management. These commanders are support pieces that help the rest of the deck thrive, but they're not well suited to being built around themselves. Eligeth, a Type B commander, is not the commander this deck wants to be built around, because at 6 mana, having huge portions of the deck set on scrying means we're taking some very underwhelming game actions whenever Eligeth is not in play, the majority of the game. But Siani can reliably supply sources of scrying for us if we instead build around flyers, which is already a very potent kind of deck with a lot of support and no shortage of ways to close out the game. And to add to that, all that filtering and card draw also makes it easy to find and assemble combo pieces. But as the deck powers up, what mono blue is going to struggle with most is the speed to compete at those stronger tables. The axis that blue most operates on is time. Spending 2 mana to stop your 5 mana commander effectively costs opponents their whole turn, if not more. And spending 7 mana on Cyclonic Rift sets opponents back several turns and leaves them vulnerable to attack. Because Mono Blue operates on time, its bottleneck will usually be about speed as well as resource density. As a result, whenever the deck powers up, you'll probably see fewer and fewer of these scry effects that show up in EDH rec lists, and fewer single flyers as well. What you'll start seeing is more cards that can represent multiple flyers per card while putting in work elsewhere. And in particular, at really high power tables, you'll look more at flyers that interact and supply card draw to help assemble a winning combo package. The first set of cards I want to highlight are those that represent critical resource swings that bring the deck online instantly. You didn't need me to tell you that mana drain was good, but in this deck especially, it'd probably be worth investing in. What I don't want to see are creatures that are only in here because they scry. The scrying is gravy, the card draw is gravy. The core of the deck are our flyers and what they're doing for us, whether it's winning through combat damage or assembling a combo. Wither acts a lot like Death Touch in how it discourages your opponents from blocking. So creatures with attack and combat damage triggers are the first thing that I'm thinking about. Since our commander also draws cards from it, we'll cater our removal towards reducing enemy creature toughness to 0. But these kinds of decks often struggle with closing games out, especially because Mono Black doesn't have a lot of the go-wide finishers that other colors have. And combos involving non-creature permanents are incredibly fragile. So I want to try to align our win condition with what's already happening in the deck. Creatures and removal, possibly even reanimating a creature-based win con instead of relying on certain enchantments to provide critical recursion. Just like Red, Mono Black also struggles with some overly narrow removal, but there's no liquimetal torque for creatures to save us. Instead, when the deck can justify it, I usually like using discard effects as a way to move cards into the graveyard, where Black has powerful exile pieces. Sadly, Massacre Girl's trigger only sees enemy creatures dying, so we can't lean on our usual tools for this, and we'll have to expand our horizons a little to accommodate our more combat-focused strategy. Lastly, even though I do think the most optimized build for this deck is going to play like a combo control deck, that's also how I usually build Mono Black, and today I kind of want to build something other than a combo deck. I'll leave some slots open in the deck list for anyone who wants to experiment, but when you pair up Wither with Toxic, you get a kind of imitation infect that leans more on the creature aspects of the deck, which I like, as well as makes the decision of which blocks to make more interactive for your opponents. Either they don't block and get closer to losing, or they do block and you draw cards off your creatures instead of having to spend removal on it. After building Otrimi, I've been looking for other homes for Kins with the Bleak Coven and other of those black poison counter cards that we got from All Will Be One, and I think this could be it. While I think these decks have a bad habit of running far too much removal, the pieces I most gravitate towards are those attached to creatures like those on Massacre Girl. And with Black almost completely unable to remove artifacts and enchantments, I really like Larceny to remove them before they become a problem. I also want to highlight Drana for her ability to pump up our creatures to survive sweepers like Massacre Worm and Girl. And for anyone interested in the poison counter route for the deck, I really think these cards are going to be most essential for that build. Monocolor decks often have difficulty competing with other decks that have more colors, allowing them to compensate for the weaknesses of its components. This creates some must-have cards that you just can't play those colors without, and the high demand for those cards often offsets all the money that you save by not having to build an expensive mana base. What these decks illustrate best, though, is the importance of identifying what is and is not a bottleneck for your deck, and use that information to inform decisions about cuts and swaps for the future. This is only the second time I've done a 3-deck video like this, so feedback is much appreciated. If you have any ideas for how to improve this format of video, go ahead and drop a comment, or if you'd prefer I stick to more in-depth single-deck videos, let me know that as well. As always, thanks for watching, and happy gaming.